So on the slides, what is money? And I'll give you a brief outline of what is money. I think not a lot of people ask these questions. So what's the origin of money? Has it changed over time? How's money produced? And these are questions that I never asked myself until I encountered Bitcoin. And it's not a natural question that you ask. You just accept what you've grown up with until a certain stage. But it's good to understand the foundations of money because Bitcoin is money at the end of the day. So we'll cover that first of all. I know she's very popular in the Bitcoin space, so if anybody wants to take this further, Lynn Alden, who's a great analyst in the Bitcoin space, wrote a book called Broken Money. Fantastic read, and we're just skimming the surface here of it today. So on the left, money doesn't exist, as we arrived on Earth, and as humans evolved, it was an evolution in itself. So money didn't precede trade. Trade came first, but the measurement of trade was a difficult thing to do. So you can imagine people in the deserts, the jungles, all around the world, and these villages had to trade goods and services with someone. And in order to do that, how could you measure something at the start? So there's this kind of barter economy where you would say, like, I have a certain amount of goods, so they were spears or sandals or whatever it was, and somebody else was a food producer and they had a certain amount of fish that they caught. But how do you determine, if I was to give up one spear, how many fish would that be equal to? So there were some ledgers at that time as well where people would have kept track of who owed who what, but this was all very efficient. Without a unit of account, without a unit to measure, it's a very efficient way of doing business. So people started then doing these early experiments with money and started using different units. So people might have, in different regions, used things like rocks, as currency, and people used shells, and people used beads, and you can see this throughout history. But you can see all the flaws in each one of those as currency. It's not going to work. It doesn't work in the modern day. It wasn't quite efficient back then. There was an eventual winner out of all these different experiments, and that was gold. And I think the important thing about this is that no one central authority or one central person or one individual declared gold as the winner out of all this. Gold was declared the winner through natural competition of money. So all these different forms of money were competing against each other, and gold naturally rose to the top. And that was likely a process that happened over many, many years. I think it's obvious when you look back that likes of shells and beads couldn't compete with something like gold, but it still happened anyway, and people still experimented for a while. And I think we're actually in that stage right now as well, where we're experimenting with these different forms of money. So you've got people who still advocate for gold, you've got the fiat system, you've got Bitcoin, you've got other cryptocurrencies, and I think there's a clear winner already, but yet we still continue to experiment. So look, anyway, gold, it had great properties for money for the time. It won that natural competition. It was durable, it was portable, it was divisible, recognizable, it was scarce, it had all the right properties that you needed for money back then. And gold went on for thousands of years after that to be used as global money, so everybody settled on gold. Then came what I would call, and what many others would call, is the fiat experiment. So this is a big section. Again, I'm just skimming the surface. But look, the general gist of it is gold had its flaws. As trade started becoming faster, as labor mobility started becoming faster, as we could transport things better, as technology got better, gold really lagged behind and it couldn't keep up. So as a solution, people started storing their gold in vaults, and then they were issued IOUs, which are paper receipts for those pieces of gold that they could come back to the vault and redeem for gold. And that's kind of how the banking system then formed. So the bank was storing the gold, and the receipts were what we would call paper money today. So if a bank had, say, 10 million worth of gold in their vault, they should have 10 million of receipts circling about that economy. But what happened, and the main problem with that, was that the number of receipts started exceeding the amount of gold that was held in the vaults. And it was essentially banks playing games with other people's money. So they were lending out money that they didn't actually have. And that had a problem whenever people came to return to get their gold out of the bank. It wasn't there, and that's where the term bank run comes from in history. So eventually, these individual banks that were over-lending, central banks came in and they were put in place to try and encourage good behavior and stop the individual banks from lending and creating excess money. It had good intentions, but again, bad outcomes. Central banks ended up doing the exact same thing that the individual banks done. And I think there's a lesson in that. I think humans in charge of other people's money is never a good idea. And you can see many of cases about that in history. So doing some research here, central banking, it can be tracked back to the 1600s, but I've actually seen some examples of it back in the 1100s, 1200s in parts of Asia. But it wasn't until about the 1900s that central banking became widespread, and basically most countries at that stage would have had a central bank in their country. And the US, which was a superpower at the time and a real up-and-coming nation, they dominated the early 1900s. And they accumulated a lot of gold. There was World War I at the beginning of that, and they actually were beneficiaries in that in terms of gold. Not long after central banking, and it became widespread, the Great Depression hit then in the 1920s, which lasted for years. So in 1933, the US attempted to fix things by putting controls in place, and one of the controls they put in was that people couldn't hold gold anymore. It was only the banks, the central banks, that could hold gold, so it actually became illegal for people to hold gold. Then in 1944, towards the end of the Second World War, the US amassed huge amounts of gold. They were obviously victors from the Second World War in ways, and there was a lot of other war-torn countries, and they were in recovery at this stage. And there was, in 1944, there was an agreement then between the US and 44 different countries to use the dollar, the US dollar, as the reserve currency. And I don't know why they agreed to that, hand over the controls of money to another nation. But again, post-war, it could have made sense to everyone. Then, as everyone was trading then in dollars instead of gold, it made trade easier globally. So if you were to buy oil or goods off certain countries, you would have used dollars. So dollars then became widespread, so it became a currency that was in most countries. But some countries figured out that the dollar wasn't actually as valuable as the gold itself, so countries started to hold gold themselves, and the dollar started losing power. So in 1971 then, the US decided to break the peg from the dollar to gold. So that meant that no matter how much gold, it didn't matter how much gold the US had, they could create as much currency as they could. So they could basically, they had an unlimited money printer. And I would say that's since when most people that research this topic would say that that's when the money system broke. Then on the right-hand side, we entered the new era. So in 2009 then, Bitcoin was created by Satoshi Nakamoto, and I'll cover more of that in the next slide. So why was Bitcoin created? And I think, first of all, before you go into why was it created, you need to understand who created it and what their motive was behind that. So the cypherpunks, I'm not sure if you've heard about them, but they're privacy-orientated people. They write code, they're pro-freedom, and Satoshi was part of that cypherpunk community. And they've been trying since this move away from decentralized money towards centralized money in the 1970s to try and create a digital currency or an e-currency which people could use, basically trying to create a neutral currency that was out of the hands of the government and this decentralized money. So on the left of this, we have a snippet of the very top and the very bottom of the white paper. So the white paper is a technical paper that Satoshi released in 2008. I think it was October. I think it was Halloween 2008, actually, 3 months before Bitcoin released its first block. And I think it gives a good indicator on what Satoshi was trying to achieve. So the bottom, and if you get the chance as well, the white paper, I think it's only 9 pages. It is a technical document, but I think you can still learn from it. So the bottom snippet on this is the references that Satoshi used, and it's all references from previous decades. If you look at it, there's references from 70s, 80s. I think there's actually one from the 1950s. Most of these were individual pieces of work and great pieces of work, and they made progress towards creating this decentralized system, these decentralized network, decentralized money. But they all ultimately failed. But they were the important building blocks that were moving towards Bitcoin. And I'll talk about more about that in the next slide. So On the right-hand side then is a snippet from the Times newspaper in 2009, the same day that Bitcoin was created. And I think this is a clear indication to why Bitcoin was created from Satoshi. So the great financial crisis of 2007 happened, and the system that was put in 1971 helped bail out the banks. And you have to ask yourself, was that a fair thing to do? The banks created the great financial crisis in 2007, and they were able to use a system that was built in 1970 to bail themselves out. And I think actions like that are fuel for somebody, for a group of people like the cypherpunks, to work harder to create money that no one controls, and again, take the money out of the hands of the government. And I think that one of the important things is Satoshi went and done that. It created this system that was decentralized, but Satoshi also left the project then. The project wasn't left in the hands of a community, or sorry, an individual or a company or a CEO or anything like that. It was left in the hands of a community. And I think it's a very important thing and a very important distinction between Bitcoin and the other attempts at creating digital currency. So I suppose what this slide and the previous slide is trying to summarize and trying to attempt to create a concise message is that money was neutral for thousands of years, and since 1971, governments are able to control money, and it's had a severe impact on society. It's not taught in schools as well. I think this was mentioned earlier, that this change happened, and I think everyone should understand how we arrived at this stage, and that the money that we use today is very different from the money throughout history. So I think if you look at the fiat system then that was created in 1971, I think you can link it back to a whole new level of control that's never been in our era before. I think you can link it back to high inflation. Clearly, I think everybody's aware of that by this stage. I think as well as inflation, I think you kind of have these thoughts where once you go really deep into this topic, you can see that the move from neutral money and the government money caused a lot of the modern day problems as well. So I think, again, really going into the depths of this, the fiat system, you link it back to the enablement of war. It actually makes the start of a war much easier. It's clearly linked to inflation, but I think it can also be linked to a lot of the modern day lifestyle that we have as well. I think there's a lot of short-term thinking in the fiat system, and I think it's led to poor lifestyle choices and poor lifestyle in general, despite all the technology that we have. I think we're more short-term thinking now than we ever were. And I think on the opposite side, on the gold standard, on a neutral standard before, I think humans were long-term thinkers. I think they usually thought about this generation and the next generation, and they were planning out to make the future generations better. I think fiat, with its built-in inflation system, has turned us all into short-term thinkers, and Bitcoin's an enabler again for us to get back to long-term thinking. So why was Bitcoin created? Bitcoin, to me, was created to get humanity back on track. So Bitcoin, Bitcoin technology, another section that I cover in the book. And one of the things I think people often get wrong about Bitcoin is that they're looking at it as a technology only, as if somebody thought in 2009, it would be good to try and improve on digital currency, to try and improve it for technical reasons, because everything was going digital at that time. And that's why I think it was good and important to give you that backdrop, first of all, of the previous two slides. There's no company behind Bitcoin. It's completely decentralized, it's open, and it's flawless. Nobody intervenes in that process. Now, the technology is outstanding, don't get me wrong, but people should be aware of the problem that it's solving. And I think if you were to take one thing away from this presentation today, I would say, although it's improved on gold in terms of technology, Bitcoin isn't solving a technology problem, it's solving a fundamental money problem. If I was to summarize the technology of Bitcoin, I would say it utilizes all these standalone components. Again, so I mentioned this slide, it's not blockchain, it's not crypto, it's not whatever buzzword is thrown out there. It's a blend of these components that work together. It's kind of an amalgamation of what's here in terms of technology, and it works in that completely automated way. No head to the protocol, no CEO, no individual, no company behind it. And it's really phenomenal how it came in through this anonymous creator, and it's been left in the hands of the community. I think it's a real engineering work of art. At the bottom of this diagram, you'll see the word consensus listed, and the entire protocol, so the whole infrastructure around it, is underpinned by consensus. And that means that the components and the rules of Bitcoin will remain the same as agreed by the network. And it's important that the money we have, we understand what the rules are and that everybody can agree on the rules. I can't spend too much time on the technology side of Bitcoin at the moment, but I do cover, again, more of this in the book. So Bitcoin milestones, I do finish up in the last section of the book talking about the drivers for Bitcoin and drivers for adoption and where I think the price is headed in the long term. So these are some of the milestones since Bitcoin's inception. I think it illustrates the progress. In 16 years, again, without anything like a CEO at the head of it, the progress is unbelievable. I had somebody who wasn't really that familiar with Bitcoin say to me that they thought 16 years later, if Bitcoin was going to be a thing, then it'll be widely adopted by now. Not realizing this is all organic growth. Again, no CEO at the head of it, no marketing teams, anything like that. They didn't realize that this growth had happened, but they also didn't realize that there was no marketing team behind it. And I think somebody mentioned it as well about the internet protocol. TCP/IP was there in the 1970s. But if you look at the first 2 decades of TCP/IP, the start of the internet, it was very quiet in terms of major milestones. And in the 90s then, it took off, and that's where we've seen the growth. And we're moving towards the end of the second decade for Bitcoin. So I suppose the message in that, it does take time for these things to play out, especially if there's nobody driving it behind apart from organic growth. And I think this growth will continue, and we'll see many more milestones ahead. So Bitcoin's resilience, I don't want to be the person that says that it's straightforward in Bitcoin, because it's not. Over the years, there have been many attacks on Bitcoin, mainly from different entities like the governments, mainstream media, and the banking system. And that's really the people who are closest to the fiat system. And these aren't all the challenges that are faced, but it is some of the major ones that you could say hindered some of the adoptions so far. And I think there's going to be more of these attacks to come. But the funny thing is, after all these events, Bitcoin, it shows immense resilience. It always comes back, and it usually comes back stronger in terms of network and adoption and price. And I think there's a lesson learned for people in this. Ignore the short-term noise, ignore the headlines, and look at it as a long-term project. I think when we come back to an event like this in a couple of years, again, we'll be talking about what happened to Bitcoin over those years, but it'll all be in the past, and I count these all as temporary blips. And we'll watch it go on to strength over time. Next slide is a bit more lighthearted, and I think it's where we get to laugh at the mainstream media, who, as we say, aren't too fond of Bitcoin. This is the Bitcoin obituaries. The site is 99bitcoins.com, I think it is, and the red is every news article, every red dot in this, every news article that ever declared Bitcoin dead, so 476 times so far. And again, the lesson in that is don't pay attention to a lot of the headlines. How valuable can Bitcoin become? I think many have seen a graphic like this before, and Peter Dunworth spent a bit of time on this as well. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that for people who are focused on price, no one's late to Bitcoin. It's shown here that Bitcoin's a $1 trillion asset, and the global total worldwide assets are worth 900 trillion, so it's got 900 times to grow in terms of price. And that's its total addressable market, what I would consider. So I've done a few things on the left here where if Bitcoin's market cap was, say, to match gold, so in the gold color beside it, you can see it's a tenth of the size at the moment of it. But if that was to grow to the size of gold, which it's a much better version of gold, then it'll grow from the price it is today up to around $500,000 to $600,000. What if Bitcoin was to capture 5% of this? I think Peter did a good job earlier outlining some of the flaws in real estate and the bond market and stocks and things like that. Then each Bitcoin would be worth $3 million at that stage. But then once you're on this for long enough and you try to understand the path that it's taken, I think you have to ask yourself what happens if Bitcoin captures everything here and we return to money being its right set up in the world. And at the end of the day, then you won't be measuring things in Bitcoin, or you won't be measuring things in dollars or fiat, you'll be measuring things in Bitcoin. So final slide. I think this is what the history books will look like when historians look back. Gold came first. Then a short fiat experiment, which I think this period of time will be extensively studied. Then Then came Bitcoin. I don't know how long it will take for us to get off the fiat system and onto Bitcoin, and I don't know how long Bitcoin will go on to last after this, but the transition will happen. It's already in motion. I've colored these three assets in their most natural color, so gold in its natural gold color, Bitcoin in its recognizable orange color, and fiat in an appropriate color of brown, which I think best represents the fiat system. So, why Bitcoin? I think everybody should have the opportunity to understand the background of money and why Bitcoin was created. At the heart of it, Bitcoin's designed to remove the power of anybody creating their own money. And I think it's clear at this stage that those that are doing that are creating it for their own benefit. And Bitcoin's the opposite of the fiat system. It's designed to distribute money fairly and evenly amongst the world. It's a fair system for everyone. I spend more of my day now talking about Bitcoin to people in my life, whether it's family, friends, work colleagues, and I think the message is getting clear as the years go back. Again, very difficult to understand years ago, and I think it's become clear. And I think things like inflation and housing crisis and things like that are making it more relative to talk about. So there is clear progress, and I think an event like this today shows that there's clear progress. But at the same time, I think it's important to get it right in this part of the world very soon. The US, Africa, Central America are all making big strides in terms of adopting this as a technology. And while it's improving here, I think we're lagging behind. And I think it's up to us in the room and everybody here to step up and to advocate for a technology like Bitcoin. It's very freedom orientated. And if we're going to do it for our generation and future generations, I think we have to start this now, so no one else is going to do it for us. I think we have to do it. I think we have to step up if we want to see this part of the world thrive. So that's all for me. I hope everybody got something from it, and thanks very much for listening.